The substance that has most effect upon our culture and upon our lives is completely invisible. We can only see its effects. This substance is information. Science started out as an offshoot of magic. The two became completely divorced from each other and bitter enemies, although I tend to think that at the present moment the two are growing back together again. I was reading recently that people at the cutting edge of quantum physics believe that information is a super weird substance, to quote the actual phraseology, which underlies everything in the universe, which is more fundamental than gravity or electromagnetism or the two nuclear forces. This would tend to suggest that our entire physical universe is the secondary byproduct of a primal information, or, to put it in more magically acceptable terms, in the beginning there was the Word. Born in Northampton in 1953, I started life in an area known as the Boroughs. This was the oldest area of Northampton and also the poorest. It was where the rural families who'd been drafted into the towns to man the conveyor belts of the Industrial Revolution ended up. I found myself surrounded by a monochrome world of limited opportunities. However, when I was 7, I picked up my very first American comics. These were bright, garish, four-colour things that, rather than taking place against some anonymous northern British backdrop, took place in cities like New York, which to me were as exotic as Mars. The idea of buildings of that scale, the idea of this modernness that seemed to pervade everything. This was a futuristic science fiction world. And then, against that backdrop, you had these incredibly colourful characters who had these amazing powers, who could transcend their human limits. I'd already been attracted to mythology, fairy stories, anything which had people that could fly or become invisible or could lift huge mountains or could perform any of these heroic acts for which gods and heroes are largely famous. And so, having discovered the American superhero books, it was a fairly natural transition. On my 40th birthday, rather than merely bore my friends by having anything as mundane as a midlife crisis, I decided it might be more interesting to actually terrify them by going completely mad and declaring myself to be a magician. This had been something that had been coming for a while. It seemed to be a logical end step in my career as a writer. And the problem is that with magic, being in many respects a science of language, you have to be very careful what you say, because if you suddenly declare yourself to be a magician without any knowledge of what that entails, then one day you are likely to wake up and to discover that that is exactly what you are. There is some confusion as to what magic actually is. I think that this can be cleared up if you just look at the very earliest descriptions of magic. Magic in its earliest form is often referred to as the art. I believe that this is completely literal. I believe that magic is art, and that art, whether that be writing, music, sculpture or any other form, is literally magic. Art is, like magic, the science of manipulating symbols, words or images, to achieve changes in consciousness. The very language of magic seems to be talking as much about writing or art as it is about supernatural events. A grimoire, for example, the Book of Spells, is simply a fancy way of saying grammar. Indeed, to cast a spell is simply to spell, to manipulate words, to change people's consciousness. And I believe that this is why an artist or writer is the closest thing in the contemporary world that you are likely to see to a shaman. Spiritualism was the natural state of human thinking up until the Renaissance and the subsequent Age of Reason that grew out of it. Our original way of seeing the world was as a place entirely inhabited by spirits, where everything had its indwelling essence, where everything was in some sense sacred, including ourselves. The Age of Reason changed all that. While it's inarguable that reason brought many great benefits and was a very necessary stage of our development, unfortunately this led to materialism, where the physical material world was seen as the be-all and end-all of existence, where inevitably we were seen as creatures that had no spiritual dimension, that had no souls, living in a soulless universe of dead matter. That we believe that we understand the entire cosmos, but actually we understand the insides of our heads, and even then only very poorly. Was it Niels Bohr, the physicist, who in his Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics said that when we talk about or describe remote events, whether that be in the furthest stars or in the smallest and most remote quanta, that all we can ever truly be doing is talking about ourselves and our own processes. That all we see is our perceptions. We mistake that for reality. And consequently we tend to be very chauvinistic about our picture of reality, as if that were the only one. Then the only way that we can look at other cultures is to imagine that they are deluded or primitive or just haven't got it yet. That is a way in which we, in terms of information, we isolate ourselves terribly. It's our culture kind of insisting upon its own values blinds itself to what might actually be very useful concepts and ideas belonging to other more deeply rooted cultures. They offered perhaps richer readings of the world than cold behaviouralist science does. Science cannot talk about consciousness because science is a thing that deals entirely with empirical evidence, with things that can be repeated in a laboratory, and thoughts do not come into this category. Therefore, science generally tends to try to disprove the existence of consciousness. They will say that consciousness is some accident of biology, which is itself based upon chemistry, which is itself based upon physics, and wholly explicable within a normal, rational, scientific framework. Rupert Sheldrake, who is a kind of heretical scientist who put forward the theory of a morphogenetic field in order to try and understand some of the spookier effects of consciousness. I'm probably simplifying it horribly here, but I think that the basic concept was that once a form has occurred, whether that be a physical form or an idea form, then it is much more likely and possible for it to occur again. Now, Sheldrake says that this is because there is a kind of what he calls a morphogenetic field linking everything, and that once the idea existed, then it somehow existed in this morphogenetic field. It struck me that this might explain a lot of things about the way the human mind works. Even things, say, for example, like the fact that the steam engine seems to have been invented by 5 or 6 different people at approximately the same time. After hundreds, thousands of years of the steam engine not being invented, all of a sudden, within a matter of a couple of weeks, everybody is, it's steam engine time. Everybody is coming up with an idea of steam propulsion. I mean, this is similar to the idea that I put forward of idea space, a kind of a space in which mental events can be said to occur, an idea space which is perhaps universal. Our individual consciousnesses have access to this vast universal space, just as we have individual houses, but the street outside the front door belongs to everybody. It's almost as if ideas are pre-existing forms within this space. As human beings, we inhabit 2 distinct and separate worlds, 2 landscapes. We inhabit the physical world. But at the same time, since we can only ever truly experience our perception of that world, then it would seem that we more truly inhabit a world purely of consciousness and ideas. It strikes me that the land masses that might exist in this mind space would be composed entirely of ideas, of concepts. That instead of continents or islands, you might have large belief systems or philosophies. Marxism might be an island. Judeo-Christian religions might make up another landmass or continent. Human minds interact, albeit weakly, in limited ways, with idea space every moment of the day, just in order to carry out our daily lives. If you want truly unique ideas, if you're an artist or an inventor or somebody who deals in unique and fresh ideas, then you will have to plunge right into the undergrowth, into the depths of idea space in order to find those ideas that have never been spotted before. If we assume that idea space or something like it exists, then we may decide that we wish to explore that space, whether for artistic reasons, perhaps for scientific reasons, or perhaps as magicians, as occultists. The one place in which gods and demons inarguably exist is in the human mind, where they are real in all their grandeur and monstrosity. Much of magic, as I understand it, in the Western occult tradition, is the search for the self with a capital S. This is understood as being the great work, as being the gold that alchemists sought, as being the will, the soul, the thing that we have inside us that is behind the intellect, the body, the dreams. The inner dynamo of us, if you like. Now, this is the single most important thing that we can ever attain, the knowledge of our own self. And yet there are a frightening amount of people who seem to have the urge not just to ignore the self, but actually seem to have the urge to obliterate themselves. This is horrific, but you can almost understand the desire to simply wipe out that awareness, because it's too much of a responsibility to actually possess such a thing as a soul, such a precious thing. What if you break it? What if you lose it? Mightn't it be best to anesthetize it, to deaden it, to destroy it, to not have to live with the pain of struggling towards it and trying to keep it pure? I think that the way that people immerse themselves in alcohol, in drugs, in television, in any of the addictions that our culture throws up, can be seen as a deliberate attempt to destroy any connection between themselves and the responsibility of accepting and owning a higher self, and then having to maintain it. Quitting my day job and starting my life as a writer was a tremendous risk. It was a fool's leap, a shot in the dark. But anything of any value in our lives, whether that be a career, a work of art, a relationship, will always start with such a leap. And in order to be able to make it, you have to put aside the fear of failing and the desire of succeeding. You have to do these things completely purely, without fear, without desire. Because things that we do without lust of result are the purest actions that we shall ever take.